Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Arran Rogerson.
And I'm Alyssa Polizzi.
Today we have our very first special guest. His name is Andrew Tuazon. He's a visual artist, game designer, and lover of wisdom. How's it going, Andrew?
It's going good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Andrew is a friend, so the audience should know that. He is a first-time guest, but also a first-time listener. He's never listened to the podcast before.
It's okay, we're not offended.
No, we're not offended.
I mean, it's because I talk to you guys so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think most of our friends have probably never listened to the podcast, but that's okay. We decided that we would talk to Andrew about art in a very broad, maybe kind of abstract way. We're all familiar with art as something that we've experienced in our lifetime, something we've probably engaged in, something we've created. But there's patterns behind the paintings or patterns behind the song, patterns behind the book that are kind of universal to all forms of art. And that might be something that we get into to start things off, is what is happening behind all these art objects or the patterns of creation. What is it about all art forms that kind of seem to have the same sort of creative process in which you develop ideas and you bring them into physical reality through some sort of creative process?
Yeah, it's not necessarily something that I've contemplated directly, like what is art? But to me, it feels in many ways like the tapping into of the unconscious, the collective unconscious, definitely, that strikes the heart of these archetypal patterns. So you start to see these like emergent tides moving through art movements, through expressions of art, through the patterns of song, as you said. And so there's something about entering into the deep psyche that really comes into play when an artist is in the flow, that you might say. A real space where we get to sort of channel that depth that exists within the human psyche.
Right. There's two, I say this a lot, and maybe I haven't talked about this on the podcast too much, but I always think of art as having two processes, one of which is chaos and one is order, right?
Okay.
And the unconscious stuff is sort of like the creative, generative facet of art. And then there's sort of like an editing, sculpting part of art that's sort of like the order.
Yeah.
So tapping into the unconscious is certainly part of it, but there's kind of like a coming down with imposition to take that mess that's been generated and sculpt it into something that is coherent in some way.
Yeah, I mean, and in addition to that, it's like sort of what I've been thinking of recently is sort of like this idea that there's like the structure and then like the flow, which is sort of like what you were talking about.
Yeah.
So there's like the structure is sort of like the practice that you kind of put in.
Yeah.
And then the flow is like when the divine inspiration sort of like hits you, like your practice sort of like takes, like you sort of rise to the level of your competence essentially.
Right. I think everyone has some sort of process that follows that pattern in some way if you're actually successfully creating art. And we could get into like what is success and what is failure when it comes to art, because that's not clear. But for me personally, for instance, usually I have some sort of process where I just like generate ideas, lots of ideas, and I write them all down. And Alyssa knows this, that I'm always taking notes all the time on my phone. Like, I have an idea, like all the time. And that process is like letting things pour out.
Yeah.
But it's not like I just take my page of notes and like, there's the book. It's like, no, there needs to be this like other process of like taking all those ideas, throwing out all the ones that don't fit or that are stupid or don't make any sense. And then what gets left behind is like a more narrow, more constrained product that had to come after the generative process.
Yeah.
And usually like maybe you have 100 ideas and one idea is good. And that's the product. Sometimes something like that. That's kind of like my process.
But then the question is sort of like what makes that idea good?
Yeah.
And the idea is good because it's sort of communicating an idea that you're trying to get across, which in essence is sort of like what art is it's like communication.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's communicating feelings or something that's, again, kind of unconscious, kind of deeper, like verbal communication. We're being creative now. We're kind of creating art with this podcast in some sense, but we're having a very literal conversation, and that communicates something very rationally, very, again, like verbally.
Yeah.
Whereas like a painting communicates something that is deeper, which is like, I crafted an emotion and you're going to receive that emotion through the painting or something like that.
There's another facet to art that I always have found fascinating, which is it being this canvas for an individual's projection. Like a host of different people can listen to an album and get something different, or look at a painting and see something else. And maybe there's like a nucleus to that. Like there's a very particular feeling, emotional dynamic that it evokes, but the nuance of what people pull from it and project onto it, or what gets introjected back into them, sort of shifts. And so really potent art has this potential of becoming so deeply personal and meaningful for an individual to be able to look into it and see something kind of staring back at them.
Yeah, because like earlier when I said it's like communication, it's communication, but it's also a conversation.
Yes,
like you can't
that's
have
good.
art without an audience.
Yeah.
So by having the audience, it's sort of like a ping-ponging of like kind of back and forth of like this idea. And so if there's like an art that you enjoy, by enjoying it, you're sort of just as much part of that process than the artists themselves.
Right. I agree. I think that obviously there's a lot of people in the world who create art that no one ever sees, of course. But I do think sort of the process is not complete without sort of an objective eye. Like a lot of the art that I've made, which is mostly music, has never actually been listened to by anyone else besides me. And there's some sort of like idea that like I'm the audience.
Yeah,
But
that's how I would see it.
yeah, but it's like not really complete in like, because you are trying to communicate something. That's like one part of art, but you're also just engaging in this like primordial act of creation that I think is like, can be traced further and further back to, animals create things in some ways. Like art is kind of an abstraction of this primordial creative act.
Yeah, but that gets to that part also that like, I also feel that art is what makes us uniquely human
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
It's kind of what separates us from like the animals to a degree.
But what about the elephant?
I know
I
someone's going to bring up the elephant.
Right, and there's a gorilla that paints sort of
Okay,
self-portraits.
so the elephant.
They're not very good though, so
The
It's just a
elephant-
train.
it
It's just
doesn't
like
count.
The elephant that paints an elephant, does it know it's painting an elephant, or is it painting just shapes that it's sort of like taught to paint?
No, it's certainly the latter, but
you could
there's-
probably look that up, right?
Because if it's painting just the shape that it's learned, then
Yes.
it's basically like a robot painting.
Yeah.
yes, I agree. I don't actually. I agree with your statement. I'm just playing devil's advocate because
Because everyone knows that painting elephant,
everyone's seen that video. If not, go watch it.
and it's
But
pretty amazing.
It is, honestly. But I think you're right. I think there's a uniquely human trait that is born by being able to create art, because it's like the mixing of having one foot in the world of the unconscious and the deep archetypal space, and then being able to translate that through consciousness to materialize it into the world, to grab different objects and mediums to make that happen. And you see it, I don't know, maybe you know, Arran, but like what's like the earliest cave paintings that we have is like extremely early in the evolution of humanity that we start to see art and pottery and all of these more design elements coming through. And it's not really something that's associated with the greater animal kingdom. It's uniquely human.
I'm gonna get it like a little meta, a little abstract here. Right? We don't have to follow this thread, but I do think that part of what separates humans from animals is culture, right? And so like you have biological evolution that's going for a very, very long time, billions of years, and then humans, they have this thing called culture, right? They have consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like they're able to turn the world into objects. They're able to perceive the world as sort of like a place of materials, and those objects can be interacted with like tools, right? Humans can like pick up a stick and it becomes part of the arm now. And their ability to absorb objects is like this sort of materialism that's unique to humans. And that's where you get culture. So I think that art in many ways is that process where you're taking the objective world, let's say, the world of objects, and you're finding ways to abstract creative processes onto those things. And that's why it is sort of uniquely human.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of it's not literal. And
Right.
it's like taking things to like another sort of level, you know? It's like the abstract level.
Yeah.
You still have forms of art that are really grounded, you know, like the forming of pottery, art that's really just kind of an expression without too deep of an intellectual process coming through, just very instinctive and primordial in a way that is, I don't know, maybe it's hard for me to say like it's less refined than maybe what art has turned into over time, where we've
I
gotten.
think it's definitely less refined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when you bring up pottery, like pottery started as a function, you know,
Yeah.
it started off as
Yeah.
like a practical use of something. And then I don't know
But
how
we
the
didn't have to
timeline
make
works.
it beautiful, you know. We didn't have
Exactly.
to give it shapes.
I imagine that came
Yeah.
later. It's
Yeah.
sort of like the decoration of it. But I don't know either. So
Right. I mean, and so this gets into that kind of like age old question or kind of like snobby argument of like what is and what is not art. Right. And it's complicated. I don't think there's like a qualitative a qualitative difference as much as there's sort of a like quantitative difference, as in like creativity can become so refined that it almost becomes like cyclical, where you're like getting like creative about being creative, and it's like kind of ascending into like such an abstract realm that starts to become like quote unquote art. Like it's not functional except for being this creative act,
Yeah.
and the creative act itself is compelling. But like, at what point does pottery become art? It's creative, obviously. If you're creating a pot, you're engaging in some sort of creative process to do that.
yeah.
But when does it start to become art?
But I feel even having that conversation or that idea is what makes us human as well.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of like when does one thing turn into another? It's like it's like when does one practical thing turn into an abstract thing?
Yeah.
And like I don't know any animals, really. I don't know any animals, but I don't know if they think about that.
Yeah. Let's not pursue that thread about
No, we
animals.
don't. No, we don't have to.
But let's get into like personal relationships with art a little bit. So if you are a regular listener, you know that I'm a musician. I did the music for the podcast. So that's, well, I was artistic before that, but that really is sort of like the like main art form that I've engaged in. Like I started drawing first. That was like my first art form. And I think for like a lot of kids, drawing is what comes first. And that kind of progressed into music, which became a lot more kind of glittering and like spectacular and like loud, obviously, which like drew my attention. But it came to me when I was like 15 is when I started playing music, and it was something that felt very like unlimited and sort of full of potential, like a kind of like a new landscape, almost like a gateway that like opens up where it's like there's an infinite world here to explore, and it's pure and clean, and like no one can like ruin it for you. And that was kind of like my introduction to art through music, is like why it was so powerful and why like it grabbed me so strongly was the kind of purity and beauty and potential within it.
How do you contrast against the early experience of drawing? Why didn't it hold that same sense of potential or purity?
I think it did, but it wasn't quite as mature yet. And probably if I'd never been exposed to music, I mean, whatever world that would be. But let's say I never like heard music as a kid, I'm sure I would have kept drawing, and I probably would have been actually like really drawn, no pun intended, to drawing and to continuing that art form, because it is something that I kept doing through like freshman year. Like I was in art class, and my art teacher thought I was like incredibly good, as for my age at least. Yeah. And it was like, you should join like the advanced class next year. And then I didn't.
I could venture a guess, but
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be like kind of too jokey.
Do it.
My guess is that music gets girls. And drawing,
that's part of it.
Drawing doesn't.
No, that's definitely part of it. Music is sexy.
Yeah.
undeniably, I mean, yeah, you could argue that like there's certain genres of music that like aren't very sexy, but like I kind of feel like all music is sort of sexy.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's very
Yeah.
embodied. It's very physical. It makes
Yeah.
you want to dance.
It's something that's inherently, for the most part, meant to be performed,
Yeah.
meant to be displayed. And it's not like your art piece that's being displayed. It's you. You're the art piece and also the music and your instrument that you're playing, but you.
Right.
well.
And that could get into a bigger conversation about like what is like the music scene or what is like pop, which is like, it's not just music. It's
Yeah.
like, it's like the image, it's the individuals, it's the idea of like the rock star and the way he dresses and how he like breaks all the rules and like has long hair.
Yeah,
And like,
there's like more of a personality and lifestyle to it.
right. And that's very attractive to everyone, but like to young people especially.
Yeah.
It's like,
definitely.
you have drawing and it's like, oh, this is fun. And then you have like sex and it's like, you know, it makes sense to be like, well, I'm going to go in that direction instead. But to be honest, I don't think my music has like helped me in the realm of girls at all. Maybe if I'd been like born like a few decades earlier or something like that in a different scene, but I think it's mostly just appeared to people as like a pretty strange pastime.
Yeah.
But
Andrew, tell us a little bit about your art.
Oh, just sort of like my introduction to it.
Yeah.
I mean, my introduction to it is sort of through my older cousin who was like really good. And I guess it was just like a way to like kind of emulate that. But I did get more drawn to it, I think, because of just like as like kids, a big part, especially like in our upbringing, is like kind of being raised by TV. So there is like cartoons. And I think for me, ultimately, there's sort of like something spoke to me more about like stories, and art was always just sort of like a vehicle to kind of like tell stories through. Because like even for me right now, my goal has always kind of just been to draw good enough in order to get like this story or this idea across.
Yeah.
I never really want to be like this amazing artist, and I don't think I'm quite in that area anyway. But you know, that's sort of what, and that's when I speak to like communication as well. Like art is sort of just like this medium to communicate something through.
right. So I mean, was drawing for you in the context of comics or Dragon Ball Z to begin with? Was that like
yeah.
what you were paying attention to?
I mean, it wasn't Dragon Ball Z, but it was Dragon Ball. But yeah,
Dragon Ball. Okay. Yeah.
that was sort of like my introduction, and like that started kind of the addiction
Yeah.
to the whole thing.
Did you start drawing Dragon Ball, like imitation?
I mean,
begin with?
I tried, but I wasn't really good at it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. But imitation, I feel like, is where it first starts, usually.
Yeah.
yeah,
For all artists, really.
I mean,
Pretty
it also
much.
helps that like a lot of my friends were also really into like drawing, and I think
Yes.
kids in general are into drawing.
Yeah.
It seems like it. Yeah.
And then they sort of like taper off as they get older.
Usually. And that's, you know, you could wonder why that is. I think partially is like people as they mature lose touch with their unconscious sort of free, sort of careless side that is like so powerful in children.
Yeah.
Like the way that children are so playful and
Well,
they like
yeah.
want to touch everything and like they just like will like lie on the ground and stare at the sky and like not care about anyone who's watching.
Yeah.
Like that's true for art as well. It's like just like creation. And as you like mature, there starts to be more of kind of like this narrowing, this structure, this idea of like, well, I need to act a certain way. And
Yeah, exactly.
it's kind of like anti-art almost. the
Because there's
process.
like an individualism to
Yeah.
art when you're that age, and then as you get older, you sort of like try to conform a little bit more,
Yeah.
and so you like kind of lose that bit of individualism.
Yeah. How come you never conformed, Andrew?
I mean, that's multi-layered. I don't know if this podcast is going to be talking about. We're talking about art. We're not talking about all these other factors.
It's true. This is a podcast about psychology, though, as well.
That's true. We're going to analyze you now.
Well, I mean, if we're going to go in, I would say I never conformed because I've always felt like an outsider.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I never felt the need to kind of conform to anything, which is like good and bad, you know?
Right.
I think it's reflected in Andrew's art. If you get to see it, it's this sort of in like incredible mishmash of so many different elements going on, and yet it has like this unique tone to it. And what he said earlier about ultimately art being a vehicle for story is true in relation to Andrew's work. That the characters that sort of crop up from his imagination and the stories that come through, to me, have always been so dynamic. And it's really less about like details being perfect or making sure you got your great art school degree, which by the way he already has one, but still it's like it's about the entire experience that seems to communicate greater nuances and narratives and character sort of energy that comes through and off the page. And that's what I really find most compelling about his art.
How would you describe your art, Andrew? In terms of like genres, influences, what's the feeling that comes across?
It sounds a
from your
little
art?
hokey, but I sort of deem it as like transcendental-ish.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't quite want to call myself like a transcendental artist, but I do feel
It's probably a thing, right?
I'm sure it's a
Yeah,
thing,
yeah.
and I'm actually a fan of a lot of them. But
Okay.
but yeah, I would say I lean kind of into that, but then also sort of like mix like a kind of cartoony sort of style to it as well.
Yeah,
Right.
it's both like really heavy in the sense that I feel like I'm staring into like the eye of the universe, and then also like lighthearted.
Well, yeah, it's sort of that contrast is like
Yeah.
that the heavy and lightness
Yeah.
is like kind of, I don't know if I'm going for it, but that's sort of like what I see.
'Cause
I
I
think
think
that's a good way
I
to
think
describe
that's
it, yeah.
you, as that art, as that form of self-expression, as a
Yeah, the tension of the opposite.
yes, exactly. I think some of the recent work that you've done that's posted on your social media, and we'll link that in like show notes and things like that, shows that really interesting mix between highly transcendental, conceptual art coming through, delivered in a way that is still relatable and interesting and funny. It's pretty funny still. So it's a really unique mix.
Right. I think that Andrew's art, I think a good way to phrase it is sort of like a tension of opposites is true, is that there's a lot of beauty in it. Like it's very beautiful and cosmic, but it's also like very ugly and like depressing.
Yeah.
And it's like both at the same time,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is hard to do.
Certainly.
And there is something very modern about it in a sense because it is sort of like a hybrid of different styles. Like it feels like it is a coming together of a lot of different influences and ideas into something that like feels very unique. And that's I think the mark of someone who's actually sort of found their voice in art.
Well, yeah, thank you. I don't think I've found it yet. I'm still kind of looking for it, but
Well, the search never ends, right?
Yeah.
You just
It
kinda keep going.
shouldn't.
but it speaks to the idea that like, you know, art is sort of like a self-portrait of sorts.
Yes.
Like everything someone creates, it sort of has to come from a certain place inside of them.
Right.
And so they're expressing a part of themselves through every piece.
Right. I think art, I mean, there's probably exceptions. Well, I mean, especially if you get into like classic artists, I would say that like all art is like autobiographical,
Yeah.
especially like stories, like novels and stuff. It's like are usually autobiographical in some way. Like you're taking parts of your own life, your own experiences. You're placing yourself as the main character in some way. Cause like how else can you create? And, you know, you might like look at like Da Vinci or something and say like, is that autobiographical? And like, hard to say, but certainly,
But like even with like you say Da Vinci, I would say, and maybe this is like a little too woo woo, but
Yeah.
I would say that like every stroke sort of like is lived experience that's sort of like getting put down onto the canvas of sorts.
right. That sounds like an art critic. Like every stroke you could see 1 minute of his life.
But this is what I'm saying. It's like kind of woo woo, but like there is a part
No,
of me
there's
that
truth to
really
it.
does believe that.
Yeah. I remember it reminds me of like one quote about like Keith Moon, who was the drummer of The Who, which is like, he didn't need to practice. You know why? Because he lived it.
Yeah.
Which I always thought was such a stupid quote. It's like,
Wait,
that's
what is that?
dumb.
What does that mean?
Like his life was so extreme and intense and like crazy that like he didn't need to practice drums. Like he just had to sit down and just like live
Let it out.
and just like, it's like, that's just his life.
Well, does it mean that? But does it also mean that he practices so much, like he just lives the drums?
Right. Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
it's not
I mean,
practice.
I guess re-examining the quote, I'm not sure what it meant. And maybe when Keith Moon died, it's like he died the way he lived, which is like on the drum kit,
drumming.
like literally on the drum kit.
Wait, did he actually?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
I don't think it's like Spinal Tap or something, where the drum kit explodes while he's playing it for some reason.
Yeah.
I don't think that's how Keith Moon. He probably died of drugs or alcohol or something.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Okay. Is it my turn to talk about art?
Yeah.
In my life?
Yes, it is your turn,
I know,
Alyssa.
and I say this with so much trepidation because I've always considered myself to be artistically inclined, but not an artist. Like creative, yet not traditional in any way. And kind of from a very early age. And I remember drawing like a picture of a dog, and it was so weird, but it came like that was my dog. That's how I would draw it every single time. Weird big nose, like tail, like in a vertical. It was so odd. But even
We'll
that,
post the drawing in the show notes.
I'll redraw it for everybody. But I just had no discernible talent in that way. I was an athlete and a pretty good one growing up, and then got into music in high school, and that really became, I would say, an art form for me. But that has felt like a stress relationship. What do I always say? Like, I'm not a musician. I'm not a real musician.
Okay, not to overanalyze this or anything, but
It's
I
okay.
feel
Overanalysis is good.
It's my turn.
I feel a part of it is like an overjudgment.
Certainly.
Like you say, you're not an artist,
Yes.
but like everyone is an artist.
Yes, well, that kind
And
of
so you're putting a block
Yes,
every time you say
I
like I'm not an
agree.
artist. Oh, I'm
Yes.
not a musician.
right, because I'm looking at it through a very particular lens or comparing it to
And it's like compared to what?
yeah, well, it being in a group of highly artistic people, it's like, in an obvious, overt ways, drawers, painters, musicians, it's just like, wow, incredible. But I have followed those threads and felt like when I'm really in a flow state, like playing music, it feels like art to me. Although sometimes I've struggled to kind of write songs that felt authentically creative. But I'd say most recently, as I've kind of worked outside of like a traditional artistic space, the work that I'm doing now kind of, I don't know, sort of traversing like the realms of the psyche and weaving together these different parts, reading through symbolic systems. I feel like I'm doing art when that's happening. And I've had these moments where I feel like this is my art. This is me like weaving together these patterns and seeing these things and getting in flow state and feeling deeply creative, feeling it just flow out of me. And I wonder, like, is this what everyone else feels like when they're painting or something? So it feels like a little non-traditional in that sense, but that same sort of channel that's being tapped into that I imagine other more practiced artists might relate to.
Right. I mean, I think as Andrew just said, it's like everyone is creative and everyone could be an artist in some way if they were actually able to find the right environment or right medium for them. And everyone has different personalities.
Yeah.
But, if we were going to get into like typology, for instance, like your personality type might be drawn to a certain way of being creative, which would be different to my personality type, for instance. And like you might find that people who are really FE or extroverted feeling types like Alyssa is, there might be a more kind of primordial, deeper, more unconscious way of being creative that doesn't necessarily produce like these super tangible products of like a painting,
right?
Incredibly tangible, but like if you're someone who's going to like organize social events or organize social experiences like you're doing now, like with your classes and workshops, you're building them from scratch and you're taking some ideas and influences from other people and around, because that's what artists do, but you are creating things from scratch and they are like interesting products that you just come up with on your own. And that might be because of your personality type. Yeah. And so it's hard to say, I think it does sound kind of like cheesy to be like, everyone can be an artist. Yeah. Maybe not, but I think it's true that there are different levels, different layers. There's art within art within art. There's zoomed out art and zoomed in art. There's all these different ways that you could find a creative medium that fits your personality.
Yeah, but that's sort of what because everyone, to me, everyone is an artist. And then and when you go to the idea of like, well, is it good or bad art? Because good or bad art is still art. And then that's going to get into like this whole other big thing.
Yeah.
But which is why I'm like almost the wrong person to talk about this.
Or maybe the right person.
Or maybe the right. I don't
Sounds
know.
like you have a rebuttal, Arran.
Right. I mean, if everyone agrees on a podcast, it's not very interesting. Which is why we should probably like record more arguments between me and Alyssa. We don't really do that.
No,
But that happens
not
off
as
air quite a
much.
bit. There's all this argumentation that happens before recording the episode.
That's
and then
true.
once we hit record, it's like we act really nice to each other.
You should just have a side podcast that sort of is just like that argument. It's be like really short.
Yeah, what would it be called? I'm not even going to try. Okay.
Yeah, not right now.
So,
It'll be the shadow of the golden shadow.
Ooh,
shadow of the golden shadow.
that's not bad.
Golden shadow.
Golden shadow squared.
Shadow squared. Gotta write this down. Just kidding. My rebuttal, like, what were we even talking about?
We're talking about good and bad art.
Good and
'Cause
bad art.
everyone's an artist.
Should we even get into this? Good and bad
Well, I
art.
mean,
Hold
when
on.
else
Okay.
are you going to
Can
get
I-
into it?
can
What
I
other
just-
podcast are you going to get
Can I
into it on?
just set the stage a moment? To be clear, Andrew, I feel like what you're saying is that art should be kind of taken as it is, and kind of putting that value judgment of this is good or that is bad ultimately is not really in service to like the full capacity of everyone's ability to create art. And maybe Arran is saying there is a kind of way to look at these on a spectrum of
Yeah, I would say I would agree with you. There's a hierarchy of art, but I would say that the divisions are very loose and very subjective to a degree as well.
Yes, definitely.
To a degree, definitely. There's, I mean, I'll make a statement, which is that I think that art is functional because everything has some sort of function to it. It's sort of defined by it. Like things in the universe have some sort of function, which gives them their shape and their organization. Art is accomplishing something, and maybe that's communicating a message, communicating an emotion, evoking something. And so if art does that well, you might say it's successful art, or it's functional art, or it's good art. But it also depends, like, if the artist, were they attempting to create that message, and how close was the art to that message? Or should it be interpreted as like, it doesn't matter what the artist was trying to do, whatever the audience gets out of the art defines whether or not it is good or bad.
That's more where I lean.
It's both, I think.
Yeah.
But I would say, I think people do make absurd statements sometime where it's like, there's no such thing as or good and bad art. Like, all art is just art, and like, it's just your opinion, man. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. Is it relative? It is relative,
It's
but
relative.
it's not absolutely relative,
Yeah.
right? That's where I'm coming from.
I'm hesitant to just agree with that, but I see where you're coming from.
What's your opinion?
I think it's very relative.
We can't really illustrate this very well, though.
No,
we
I
could
know.
throw up paintings and be like, good or bad, and then we could argue about it.
I mean, they
and then
have
say
done
why,
like I've read that they have done studies across cultures to see like what is good and what is bad art, and I think ultimately, what sort of like comes out on top is landscapes, and I think that's
Okay,
because it's
I
something
like
that's sort
that.
of shared amongst people.
as in the art that is rated the most highly universally tends to be
well,
landscapes.
it's the most commonly highly rated, but I wouldn't say it's the top of any of those in that study.
Okay, but reliably, people like landscape paintings sort of universally.
I believe that's what the study was sort of
mean, it
like
makes
kind of
total
showing.
sense.
It makes sense.
It makes sense because
Yes.
nature is beautiful and that's ingrained within us.
Yes.
Yeah.
There isn't a cultural tone to nature ultimately. Yes, you can have certain land that you know it's from this part of the world, but you have these kind of cultural undertones in different areas of art that might make it kind of off-putting to another person who it isn't communicating to. Yet the land will always communicate.
Right.
What was
Yeah.
I was saying? It's like I go hiking around and I'm talking to this formation and I'm feeling in commune with the land. Like the land is art. It's like, who made this? Like God made this and it's incredible and I can't fathom it. And it communicates something deep and meaningful. The artistry of a mountainside, of a forest, of a river like winding through a valley.
Yeah.
It's breathtaking.
Yeah, because I feel a landscape sort of brings two things together. It's sort of the nature that we see with the human touch added to it. So it's sort of like bringing together this idea of like humanity on top of the universe or like the world, you know?
Right. Right. I mean, a painting is different than a photograph.
Yes.
And even a photograph has sort of an artistic spin on it.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. But like a lot of painting, I mean, if you just like look at like Monet or Van Gogh, it's like, it's not photographic the way they're painting. Like there's definitely a lot of paintings that are attempting to be as photographic as possible. And then they're like more impressionist.
Yeah.
And there's something that's being conveyed in the landscape.
It's
like
a feeling.
It's a feeling, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like a phenomenological thing of like the phenomena of nature as opposed to like literally nature. That's pretty abstract. But
Do we have any insight for our listeners about tapping more deeply into this creative well of art, how to find their expression?
right, we're getting into the part of the show where it's like, you can try this at home. Like
It's important,
it is
though,
important.
you know?
Yeah.
Because I think there's people who maybe desire to bring that more alive within themselves, who maybe deny it or maybe go through a similar experience like me, which is like, I'm not an artist yet. I have the desire or the impulse to. How does one nurture this? How do they find their voice in art?
I would say the easy answer, and it's obviously more complicated, but the easy answer is to get out of your own way. Because we stop ourselves so much.
Yeah.
There's like always like that kind of second guessing.
Yeah.
So like the ability to get out of your own way is sort of like how you can sort of like self-express to a degree.
Yeah. So to try and like ground that a little more, like specifically in examples, if you just create and tell yourself that like it really doesn't matter how the product turns out, and like one way to do that is like just tell yourself that like you're gonna do. I already said this, but like you're gonna do like 100 drawings, and if one of them is good, that's a success, and that takes off all this pressure. It like opens the gateway, and you can just like walk through it where it's like, okay, like I don't need to just sit down and create a masterpiece every time, because that is like the amateur's trap, I would say, is like the idea of like sit down and write a book, like back to front. Sorry, not back to front. That would make no sense. Maybe someone says that, but write a book.
The Japanese write back to front.
Yeah, there you go.
Exactly. Write a book like front to back, like just sit down and do it. And it's like, that's not going to work. Like you don't know what you're doing if you think that's going to happen. You have to sit down and you're going to say, I'm going to write 100 pages and I'm going to throw out 90 of them. And then I'm going to like go to those 10 pages and probably throw out another 9 of them. And then actually I might just throw out the last page and start over. And you have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And that frees you up to just create. Just like, just go. There's no pressure. No one's watching. Like, just do it.
Yeah.
And like, if it sucks, it doesn't matter. Like,
It's withholding that judgment, that like sort of judging side of yourself.
right.
That needs to do things like kind of perfectly. Then you realize it's all perfect anyway. So,
anyways, if you were, sorry, I'll let you,
No,
one
it's
last thing
okay.
about this. Like, if you were to, I always use music examples because I think about this a lot more than other forms of art. But if you take like a really good band, let's say you take like the Rolling Stones, and you just think that every time they write a song, it ends up on an album and you hear it.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you don't understand. There are probably like literally thousands of songs that Keith Richards and Mick Jagger wrote that you never heard because they weren't good and they just threw them out. Or they made it to B-sides and you heard those.
Yeah.
But there's also like C-sides and D-sides. And the thing is like the part of the process of art is like scraping away the mess of like what doesn't belong, like the wheat from the chaff, right?
Yeah.
And keeping what does belong. And the illusion is the artist just like somehow just like masterpiece. And like it's not really true.
Yeah. It's kind of trusting and leaning into a process, having faith that as you dabble in it, as you dip your toes into that water, that you're going to navigate the parts of it that feel uncomfortable and challenging, yet soon you will gain strength through practice, through trusting yourself, and your stroke gets stronger. I don't know why I'm doing this like swimming metaphor, but
stroke works for painting. It's fine.
it's true. But that's kind of what it feels like. I don't know. It reminds me of when I was first learning to like play guitar and how impossible it felt. Or even like lately I've been telling Andrew, like, I want to learn how to paint. I want to watercolor. I'm just feeling this impulse and this urge. And then sit down to do it and it's awful. And I'm just like, man, like, it's like you have to catch that judging narrative coming through. And it's not even like I want it to be a masterpiece. I feel clumsy. I feel like childlike. And that's almost part of the fun, right? Is like returning to that place of youthful creativity and imaginative capacity and actually leaning into the mindset of not knowing what you're doing and just expressing, getting into a flow state, just allowing it to come out and being okay with the product.
It's that and practice and repetition. And it's like kind of what Arran was talking about. It's like the thousands of songs you don't hear.
Yeah.
Like art is magic, you know? It's sort of like how, I believe it was like Penn and Teller or something. And he was saying that like illusionary magic is essentially someone doing a trick is just seeing someone who's willing to put in thousands of hours into doing something really simple.
Yeah.
But like they hide all of the work.
It's true.
Yeah.
And that's like what magic is.
Yeah.
And magic is just simply like hiding your work.
It's true. Like the magic of like the band all being in sync and the song is fucking awesome. And it's like, how is this possible? It's like everyone is so practiced. Everyone's tapped into that artistry. And you don't get to see all of the hours and hours or years and years it took to get to that point.
Right.
And that's part of like the carving of grit and personality and experience is just working through it and chiseling away and away until you get to a product that you feel confident about.
Right. The magic trick, the illusion is definitely a good way to frame it. And what the artist or the musician like doesn't want you to know is like how difficult and how much suffering is involved with creation. And it's like the illusion is like, wow, like being Jimi Hendrix would be so fun. Like, look at him on the stage. Like, I wish I could do that. And then he like dies at 27. And it's like, oh, why did that happen? It's like, maybe he wasn't very healthy. Maybe he like destroyed himself becoming an artist.
Right.
Same with like Van Gogh, Kurt Cobain. Like,
Yeah.
there's all these ways of like, I wish I was Kurt Cobain. It's like, no, you don't. Like, you don't know what you're talking about if you think that. Like, it'd be so cool to write Smells Like Teen Spirit. And it's like, you would die if you did that. Like, is it worth it to you? But
he gained immortality.
He gained immortality. That's one way to think about it. But also, I mean, like, you know, the idea, like you see Jimi Hendrix on stage, like you look up a video on YouTube of him performing at Woodstock and you just think like, oh, Jimmy just like walked up to a guitar and he just knew how to do that somehow. Jimmy, just like the magic guitar guy. He just knows how to shred like crazy. And it's like, no, he just played for tens of thousands of hours.
Yeah.
His entire life was sacrificed to guitar.
But this is also where another aspect of what art is comes to mind. And it's that art is essentially love. And when someone is really good at their art form, it's because they genuinely are connected and love it.
True.
Yeah.
So when you speak to like kind of Jimi Hendrix or like Keith Moon, when he says that he lives his drumming,
Yeah.
I think that is like it's an aspect of loving it. Like it's a part of you.
Definitely.
Yes.
Definitely.
And like Jimi Hendrix, I don't think you could separate him from a guitar.
Yeah.
Like I just
No, probably not.
I think there's like a lot of stories of like when he was like in the service, like he just always had a guitar on him.
Yeah.
And then he got like dishonorably discharged. I don't remember why. I think he was masturbating or something publicly.
While playing guitar.
I mean,
Because like he can't stop practicing ever. So,
He's like in basic training, but also playing guitar.
well, I mean, honestly, like this is not a joke. I bet Jimi Hendrix would poop while playing guitar.
Yeah.
Like that's probably how much he played guitar.
Yeah.
Just like any free moment, like sitting on the toilet, let's play, and
Yeah.
just
and
So-
that's what I
Playing
mean by like love.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
it's a matter of like it's a part of you,
yeah,
and
But
it's something that comes out.
it plays into like this sort of like archetypal like not like wounded artist, what's the term I'm looking for, like it's like
doomed
Tortured
romantic.
artist.
yes, thank you, like the tortured doomed artist.
Yeah.
And like I would love to get both of your perspectives on what you think is really going on when someone moves into that pattern of life. What's happening where they're so connected to that art that it's all encompassing, and many times they sort of burn out in a blaze of glory, yet still do burn out.
Maybe not in a blaze of glory. A lot of people just burn out, and it's like really like stupid.
It's true, not
and like, well, that
always.
wasn't very
Some
cool.
die on a toilet.
Some die on a toilet. Yeah,
Elvis was an artist, okay?
That's what I was saying.
died on a toilet. Yeah. I'm gonna get really abstract about it, but that biological evolution is one thing that draws us in really sharply, like family, sex, having children. Cultural evolution is something else that draws us in really sharply too, which is like creative, like cultural acts, like bringing things into material manifestation,
Sure.
building systems, constructing artifacts. And that draw is very strong, like both draws, like the biology and the culture is very strong for humans. And the cultural draw can just be so overwhelming that the biology loses and the culture just absorbs you. So like this cultural evolution just like basically absorbs you into its energy, and you just completely lose yourself in like this like amazing glittering magic of creation.
Yeah.
And because of that, maybe you don't get married, you don't have kids, maybe you don't eat, like your biology falls apart in favor of like creation. And it can be like really addictive in that way. And I do think that some personalities are just really drawn to the culture as opposed to the biology. If that's a really abstract way to think about it, but
Yeah, I like that. I don't know why I interjected with it. Yeah, I don't have a thing to say about it.
What do you think about the doomed artist? What do you think's going on?
I mean, I'm jealous of them
That's
to a degree.
That's fair. That's fair.
Like I kind of wish I was that obsessed, but maybe I don't actually wish I was that obsessed.
I feel like this is similar. Arran's always said you thought you would join the 27 club something.
Oh, me?
Like like musician who like makes it, and it's there's an impulse I think when
the making
when
it part wasn't
maybe
part
not
of
the
it.
making it
Like
part.
I'm gonna make it and then I'll die at 27. It was like, no, I think I might just die at 27.
But I think it's tied to a feeling of utilizing all of this life energy, all of that being funneled into something extremely intensely
In a short
amount of time. Like you feel all of this potential for things to materialize within you, and then it kind of like you used it all up and very quickly. Because a lot of those artists who did die at that age, it's like they were so brilliant.
I mean, it's a really big question.
Yeah.
And I mean, even if like you're asking me like about like my personal feelings, like that's an even bigger question.
Sure.
Of, like I've like had feelings. And this is gonna sound like really like dark, but like I've definitely had feelings my entire life that I was gonna die young. And I still honestly kind of feel that way.
Yeah.
That for some reason, like I'm just gonna die young. And I've been proved wrong. So far I'm still alive. But
You're still young.
I'm still
Young-ish.
Young-ish. Yeah. I mean, everyone is staying younger longer nowadays. But the sort of doomed artist, I think, is someone who is not only caught in the vortex of creation with how powerful and beautiful it is, and like the gamble of it, of like, you can't achieve anything brilliant without risking a lot.
True.
And like that can be incredibly enticing to people. And I'll say it, especially men, is like they're much more reckless and they're much more drawn to this idea of like, maybe I'll just go all in on like my art, like all my chips into the table, and like, what if I win? What if I make it? I'll be like great. I'll be powerful. Like I'll be remembered. And like that's actually incredibly enticing. And I would say that still ties into like what I was saying. It's like the sort of cultural current of like this brilliant magic. It's like you want to be a part of that. So you could like get a job at a hardware store and like have 3 kids and like that's a good life. Like a lot of people are just like, that's boring. Just like why? What's the point of that? And I think that more and more people get pulled into the creation vortex because of how much power it has in it, and also how much like. Honestly, like how much cheaper it is than like having children. Like that's another concept. Like it's like if you're going to devote your life to like having kids or being an artist, it's like being an artist is cheaper. Having kids is expensive nowadays, and like the whole prospect of it is like that's so much work. How am I even going to do that?
Yeah.
Where it's like I know how I could like become a good painter. I just like keep doing what I'm doing, just like be on my computer and just like on Photoshop, just like illustrating all day. It's like that's really cheap. So that's one more aspect of it.
Building off of what you're saying, I would say that there's also an element of almost like it's like a lottery ticket to immortality.
Yeah.
You're sort of like buying into this potentiality of being remembered, and I think that is also another aspect that like speaks to humanity is like not being forgotten.
Yeah. Well, and you're speaking to it on this massively collective scale where like on a more individual level, on a more grounded level, your memory and your impact lives on when you do create a family and when you do pass that on, and the lineage continues. But those cultural icons affect things in these massive ways where their art and their impact is felt over generations.
And with masses of people, which is sort of
Right.
like a psychic intensity.
Oh yeah. So,
Yeah, it's very rare though that anyone has that kind of ripple effect.
Oh, yeah.
But when they do,
Yeah.
it's just like
Which is why I'm saying it's like a lottery ticket
right.
to that place.
Anyways, that's how you can do art at home.
Oh, drugs help too.
Drugs. A few more tips. Drug. Let's be like really quick about this. Drugs can kind of like dip you into, like submerge you into a more unconscious state, where like it deframes your normal rational patterns,
Yeah.
and allows that sort of generative process of art, as opposed to like the editing, sculpting part. The generative process can like really like go crazy, and you can have all these crazy insights and ideas because you're deframing your normal rational sober experience.
right.
And also not judging.
Yeah.
Like you're kind of not judging what's coming out of you.
True.
I hear. I don't know.
We've never tried drugs before.
I've never tried it before.
We just read about it. More tips. Set up your environment. Like if one way to get out of your own way is to make creating art less tedious and less like, okay, I got to set up my easel and like put up like the canvas and like get all my art tools out, by which I mean paintbrushes and paint, and like got to get all set up, and that's going to take me like 30 minutes. It's like, just have it all set up and have it. If you can afford this, most people can't, but if you can afford to have like a dedicated space to creation, you can just step in and create for 5 minutes and be like, okay, back to work.
Yeah.
And the ease of that, like you get out of your own way by setting up your environment.
It's removing the barriers to entry.
Yes.
And it's just sort of like the way to like accomplish anything in general is sort of like take out the unnecessary steps. You kind of have to like the obstacles that you have to like step over to get to it.
One more tip. If you can't be good, be weird.
Yeah.
Seriously, because like trying to be a
that's true.
good artist is actually really difficult. And if you're imitating well-known good artists, you're going to be like, this looks retarded. Like I tried to imitate this really amazing painting by Raphael, and like I just like, it looks stupid. It's like, don't try to be good. Like try being weird.
Well, is it being weird or is it just being yourself?
I think ultimately that's what it is.
Yeah.
But I think it's simple. If you don't know who you are, you can't just be yourself when you do art. It's like some people don't know what that means.
I agree. I agree.
But it's like, embrace the lo-fi, embrace the like
True. Yes.
poor quality.
Yeah.
Embrace like
punk
this
about it.
strange thing that you made that like doesn't make any sense. Like lean into that as opposed to like trying to make it good, quote unquote.
Yeah. Okay. Can I throw in an extra tip?
Yeah.
I think the cultivation of community where individuals do art is extremely powerful. A sense of support system where you can practice together, where you can just be at ease as you do art. You're sharing, but you're not in each other's face. It just has this quality of creating a support system that allows you to just ease into your identity as an artist and to get that counterbalance of another opinion, to have someone step in and assist you, for you to help somebody else, and also getting different points of view, seeing other people's art, getting inspired by it. So if it's possible, even online communities honestly can emulate this in a lot of ways, just creating that hub of creative energy with others.
Andrew, one last tip.
I mean, I'll add emotional intensity.
Okay.
And this isn't like, don't do this at home or whatever. But pain and discomfort is like a really interesting driving force, but only because they're like intense. I would say you can do it also with like positive intensity, but I would say that's just harder to come by. Or maybe that just speaks to my personality.
Well, I mean, there's two questions I have. First, I guess first is a statement. Creation art can be a great way to vent.
Yeah.
So if you are experiencing a lot of pain and suffering in your life, for instance,
Create art then.
you've just gone through a big breakup.
Yes.
That's actually a really good time to create.
Yes.
And you'll find that a lot of really powerful pieces of art can be created out of suffering, out of pain, out of like intense emotion like that.
Yeah.
It is kind of rare that like, I'm so content that I'm going to create like this brilliant work of art. It's like, Probably not. It's like
It happens, but those are like probably really technically good artists as well.
sure,
True.
Where it's like where arts were almost like an athletic competition and
Yeah.
less of like
Yes.
a creative
That's why the
event.
sophomore album's never as good. Like
Right.
the band has made it.
We got all this money and like all these fans, and it's like, and then they just create like this like totally derivative piece of crap.
Yeah.
And a different aspect I would say is like, Andrew, are you saying that like maybe you should like sit on a really uncomfortable chair and your art will be better if you do that?
I think it's different for different people. Yeah. I'm speaking more to emotional and like pain and intensity. So like if I'm not saying to engender these things to happen in your life, but if they do happen to you, like art is a really good way to like kind of cope and vent process things, because you're sort of getting into a different mind space. And then the feeling of creation is also like really therapeutic and feels great.
Yeah.
So
it's a good tip.
It's like emotional intensity, but don't purposefully fuck up your life.
Don't like cut yourself.
Don't do that.
Like that's honestly, it's like not really that funny, but
no,
seriously, it's like you shouldn't actually damage yourself or
tap into purity of emotion of what you're feeling, even if it's on that other side of the spectrum. I think like powerful creation comes from desire as well, and that feeling of trying to grasp something to make something happen, and there's probably a sense of wounding in that as well, but it doesn't have to just come from a pure amount of pain. If you don't have that, if you're not experiencing it, look for where the energy sources are in your life and in your psyche. That's what I would say. Where are things pooling, and create from there.
All right, kids, now go out there and create. Okay, now it's time for a dream from a member of our audience. This is from a 25-year-old female. And here's the dream. I learnt of golden items kept in a nearby reliquary by a god named Death. A Gain asked me to help steal them. I hesitated, but agreed after convincing myself that the items were just trinkets. We succeeded, but before I left, Death created a whirlwind around me that killed 15 thieves and passers-by. I realized the items were important, stole them back, and tried to return them via a locked door, but failed each time. Death tried to kill me, but I wouldn't let her.
A lot of interesting dynamics going on in this dream. And I think, of course, what's the most striking is Death, as not only this personification as a protector and guardian of these golden items, but also as this force to really be reckoned with that is actually bringing dynamic death into the dream. And the dreamer themselves, usually we talk a little bit about the context that might be provided. The dreamer didn't actually give us much, actually very little. And so what I would say, like the instinctual response to this dream is to look at this from an extremely archetypal lens, to kind of look at the greater nature of the images and the symbols and how that impacts us on greater collective archetypal levels. And hopefully, if the dreamer's listening, they can kind of get something more deeply out of that collective interpretation, because already death is such a striking image. Change, transformation, the kind of movement between worlds that comes with the nature of death being personified. We see her in this dream. Another interesting note, Death is female.
This sort of archetypal story of stealing something from a god, I think you can even pinpoint like a few pop culture examples, like Princess Mononoke. Like they steal the god's head, and the god like wants it back, obviously, and they don't really get away with it.
Yeah.
In Harry Potter, like Death gives the three brothers the Deathly Hallows, like these three magical items, but like Death feels cheated by what happens, and like keeps searching for the last brother who has the cloak of invisibility. But this idea of stealing from a god, I think, is really interesting because it's very cosmic in its sort of scope. The idea that you would take something that belongs like to the cosmos, that kind of belongs to the universe, and take it with you. It's like you're really playing with fire. You're kind of dipping into some realm that you really don't belong, and you're messing with like the structures of reality.
Yes.
And like you're not going to get away with it.
Yeah,
Like,
even from like the mythological point of view, Prometheus, who is a titan and a god, steals fire,
Right.
brings it to humanity,
better example.
and still has to pay for it. You don't get to cheat these dynamics, these kind of universal principles where ultimately death comes for everybody or change comes for everybody. Transformation will happen in some form, even if we try to cheat it. So we're kind of seeing that playing out in this dream.
Can I talk?
Of course you can.
Yes.
Okay.
Share your thoughts, please.
I think yes to all the things you guys are saying. I would say another aspect that is sort of like that I find interesting is that there's the gang,
Yes.
which to me represents almost like society or like the masses, sort of like convincing this person to do something that they don't want to do, which is sort of like disrupt this cosmic order.
Yes.
And there's like the kind of like the hubris of society is sort of like a bad influence on you, you know? It's like making you do things that
Yes.
that you don't want.
Yes, getting caught up in like the collective group think, especially when those tides are powerful and archetypal. People feel gripped in these really strong dynamics that are pulling everybody.
Yeah. And she's hesitant because she knows deep down that she shouldn't be doing this.
Yes.
Right, but it's also very tempting.
But it is tempting.
Like
yeah.
the things that belong to gods.
But she said she only did it because she was convinced that they weren't important.
Yes.
True.
That the items were just trinkets.
So if she, by thinking that we're important, she knows that they're, shouldn't be touched. But because they convinced her that it's fine, she decided to do it.
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic going on here where there's a recognition of something holy, something sacred that's being protected by death, and something that needs to be kept safe from the greater collective wanting to destroy it in some form or steal it, whatever it might be. And that coming into play in the dream sort of triggers this event that causes the death. What is it? 15 thieves and passersby are killed in this process because death creates a whirlwind. And we think about the hubris of man, maybe just the psychic ties that we get pulled into, and what are the casualties that come from us not holding on to our sense of morals, ethics, respecting sacredness even. How does that come into play? And also, like, how is this a compensation or a commentary for this dreamer? Very curious. Hard to speak to that, but what's going on in this dream and how is that pictured against the dreamer's individual life? Are they feeling pulled into certain tides that they maybe need to question? Have they stepped into that and this is acting as another viewpoint? Because I think the dream, especially the way it ends, when we want to look at that lysis, we want to look at the closure, is that she realizes that the items are important. She steals them back, tries to return them via a locked door and cannot do it. And there's a feeling that sometimes when you've burned a bridge or when you've moved through something, there is no going back. Something's been triggered in the environment. And maybe the only way to really bring balance to this is to move forward rather than trying to return back to a place which cannot be returned to.
Right. So her actions result in the deaths of innocent people. And so she's kind of like playing with the fabric of reality or playing with some sort of cosmic structure. And when you do that, like, you don't actually get away with it. Like, you can't actually just like twist reality and have it stay put. Like, it snaps back and like it punishes you for trying to break the rules, which you actually can't break.
Yeah.
And so there is some sort of playing around with this idea of like trying to change something that you can't and paying for it, or trying to warp your own trajectory or your own life in a way that actually isn't feasible, and reality snaps back and like takes something from you. You lose. Like it's like a net loss overall. And as you said, it's something that you can't undo.
Death being feminine is very interesting. I'd like to hear you guys' thoughts, but some of the initial things that come to mind is the Egyptian goddess Ma'at, goddess of law and morality and justice, and how like when souls die and they're brought in to that space, they are judged and like I think it's like weighed against like her feather or something like that. And so there's this feeling that the feminine goddess will kind of weigh the actions of an individual and allow you to come through. Like the higher moral principle, the higher principle of justice will allow you to move through those worlds or to maybe linger forever in a kind of uncertain space, to not have that feeling of transformation. So it's bringing in a really interesting feminine principle of death kind of coming in and structuring this to adhere to this kind of moral authority of things being broken or things being desecrated in some way. And there is no turning back. Like you weigh against the feather and you do not go forward. The door stays locked.
Yeah, I mean, the question of feminine, masculine when it comes to death, you know, I mean, I think you can argue about it quite a bit, but it really just depends on like what aspect of death you're even entertaining.
Sure.
I would typically think of death as being feminine. That's my instinct.
Yeah.
But that's because I think of creation as being feminine. And I think of death and creation sort of coming from the same origin.
Interesting. I find creation to be masculine and death to be sort of be feminine. So they sort of like play off of each other in that way. But that's like in my own sort of like viewpoint. I don't know if that's, you know, supported by anything.
Explain it. Masculine creation. For me, it's like the generative process of creation, as I was talking about earlier in the episode, as opposed to the sculpting, editing, or root art.
I see.
That's that seems feminine.
I would say those seem different to me as well. Like the birthing of creation definitely is feminine.
Yeah, that's more what I think of.
But like creation. The sculpting of creation feels more masculine to me.
I agree. Yeah.
So yeah, it depends on like what form, like you were saying.
These are symbols, so they're going to have this multifaceted nature to them, and we can look at them through this kind of kaleidoscope lens and see it through a more masculine and feminine principle. This was even a question that was posed to me at an event that I did: is death masculine or feminine? And my feeling is just like both. You know, like we see these principles, these kind of universal dualities at play, or you can look at like the story of Hades and Persephone and recognize like there's a balance when the underworld is ruled by both the king and the queen. We need both kind of coming in. And so this dreamer specifically having the image of death as feminine says something about their psyche, some expression of that symbol coming in through the feminine tone. Maybe with more insight, we could speculate a little bit more deeply, but there's so much that could really be going on with a feminine death figure. And also in a way, maybe expressing that like that generative principle is being locked until things are kind of brought back into balance, that the dreamer needs to unlock a further potentiality for change and transformation that brings rebirth, that kind of more feminine principle of death, when the items are returned or when balance is restored.
Did the dreamer talk about the emotional aspects of the dream?
Very little. They said that the dream felt calm at first and then fearful and then guilty.
Okay.
So a little bit of a shift in change in tone and in the emotions coming forward, but the dream kind of building into this space more of fear and guilt is something to anchor into and to recognize why the dream images are bringing that forth and how does that relate back to certain dynamics that might be going on in their life.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadoworg.
Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Head over to goldenshadow.org to submit your dream for possible interpretation on a future episode.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time.